talk today will be delivered by Dr. Tracy Bone from the Faculty of Social Work here at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Bone's talk is entitled Deaf Studies, Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Methods to Facilitate Engagement. The talk is based on Dr. Bone's research that she's conducting in partnership with Manitoba Possible, exploring the mental health and service access needs of deaf and hard of hearing Manitobans. As I mentioned, Dr. Bone is the first kind of non-member of the Faculty of Arts to present in this series, and we're really delighted to have her here. We want to kind of break down boundaries between different groups of social scientists here at the U of M, and this is a great way to do that.
So as Royce pointed out, I am a associate professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. But I have joining with me today the research team as well. So we have from Manitoba Possible, Sherry Clark, who is a community counselor. Sherry, maybe if you want to wave. Sherry Clark. We have Jenna Lee Irwin, who is also from Manitoba Possible. We have Jaylene Irwin as well from Manitoba Possible. And we have Karamat Kalani, who is a PhD student in the Faculty of Social Work. So we all form part of the research team. And of course, you will notice on the green screen in the back is Brenda. She's our American Sign Language interpreter. And so she is a fundamental component of this particular presentation. And really, she is very much, she and the position itself is very much a focus here today. So what I want to do is I'm going to share my screen and our presentation. So you will note that today I will be starting the presentation about the study that we are currently conducting, and I will be switching to the various team members who will be doing presentations at different components as well. So we will be switching between the different views. I will now share my screen. Here we go. So I'm going to move this over a tad. So as Roy said, we are looking at deaf studies, quite specifically, culturally and linguistically appropriate methods. We are focusing very specifically on the methods that we are using in our current research study. So we have a little bit at the end talking about some of our findings. That'll be relatively brief. We are still in the middle of conducting our study, but really our focus is on looking at the process and what it means to engage deaf studies as part of a research process. So that's where we're headed today. Royce did the traditional territories acknowledgement. I would also like to acknowledge that all of us here on the research team are also on Treaty 1 territory. So we are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And again, as Royce mentioned, we respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So this is where we are going to head for our presentation today. This is our outline, looking at deaf-centric research topics. We're going to look at the particular type of research that we are conducting, which is participatory action research. We're going to talk about identity, and that will be looking specifically at myself, and I have identified myself as an inside outsider. I'm sure in some of the research that you have done, some of the reading that you've done, you will read about insiders in research, and you will read about outsiders in research, and what those two positions really mean. But I'm identifying as an inside outsider, and I'll explain that in a minute. We also want to talk very specifically about accessibility and how accessibility has been met within this particular study and how we continue to achieve accessibility or certainly work towards it. We're going to talk about the meetings, about our recruitment poster, about the survey, and our focus groups. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the community partnership itself. So that's where we're going today. And we, of course, have left some room at the end for questions. And I've confirmed with all of my research partners that everyone is keen to answer questions. So we'll just leave that on the table now. Researcher identity. I have a textbook from Young and Temple at 24, and they talk about, they write quite specifically in the area of deaf studies. That's the nature of their focus. And they talk quite specifically about outsider versus insider. Now, as I've identified here on this little name tag, my identity, who am I and why am I doing a research study focusing on deaf identity or deaf studies in general? So I'm a hearing person. I come from a predominantly hearing family, but I say predominantly because we have one family member. I have an older brother who's deaf. He's profoundly deaf. He was deaf from birth. He uses American Sign Language as his first language, and he is part of the deaf community. So, although I myself am hearing, again, I was raised with an older brother who attended the Manitoba School for the Deaf, went to Shaftesbury High School as well, and he actually just retired 2 years ago. Um, but I was raised in a family where American Sign Language was used, not often because my parents never learned sign language. At the time, they were told, don't learn sign language because then your son will never learn to speak. Well, my brother is profoundly deaf and would never gain the ability to speak orally. He communicates through sign language. That's his first and his preferred language. And so at one point, I made the decision that if I'm going to communicate effectively with my brother, I really need to learn American Sign Language in a more formal way. So I did attend a number of courses. I attended a couple of American Sign Language 1 week immersion courses. And at one point, Sherry Clark was one of my instructors in one of my courses. Um, and so it was quite exciting to be attending for 1 week. And the intention with the immersion program was that the minute you step in the setting, which was at the Manitoba School for the Deaf, the minute you attend the Manitoba School and step in the setting, you were to use sign language only. Now, of course, for those folks that were brand new to sign language, that would be really difficult for them. But for the most part, it was to be American Sign Language only. So I will say I did improve my skills and abilities at that time, but really, like any other language, you really have to use the language to continue to be really proficient in it. And so there are times when my signing is better than other times. Um, so that's why I define as an inside outsider. I'm not part of the deaf community because I am hearing. Although the deaf community isn't defined only by hearing status, it's also about values and it's about sense of belonging to the deaf community. Now, obviously, my two colleagues, Sherry and Jenna Lee, could much better explain that. Um, so I'm an outsider of the deaf community, but because of the work that I've done, because of my involvement with my brother and being part of the deaf community from that sense, I consider myself an inside outsider. I've also done research within the deaf community as well, with and alongside. My master's research was looking at barriers for the deaf offender in the hearing criminal justice system. And for my doctoral research, I wanted to explore the accessibility issues for members in the deaf community. So I did that, met with 6 deaf adults who had been diagnosed with depression, and explored what their experiences were trying to access mental health services. Completed that study. So this study really is an extension of that, wanting to expand more broadly, because we know that if you're doing a doctoral study, you really have to do that independently. So I conducted the study basically independently, but now wanted to expand into the community. And so connected with Manitoba Possible and asked if they would be interested in pursuing this particular study. And they said absolutely, because they too wanted to try and identify what the issues were for members in the deaf community, wanting to identify what access issues were, what services were available, etc. So participatory action research is very much the nature of this study, and it is defined as cooperative inquiry and looking at studying, reframing, and reconstructing social practices. So again, wanting to understand in the deaf community what some of the issues are. And you will see in this presentation that at times we include different sign language pictures. And so this is the American Sign Language sign for issues. So we wanted to understand what some of the issues were for members of the deaf and hard of hearing community in trying to access services. It's a mixed method study in the sense that we have 2 participant groups. We have deaf and hard of hearing participants, and we have service providers. Within that, we of course have a demographic form for both the different groups. With the deaf and hard of hearing participants, we have an online survey conducted through SurveyMonkey, and we're going to talk about that and what we did to make this accessible in the deaf and hard of hearing community. We also have been conducting focus groups with, again, the deaf and hard of hearing participants, and we have an online survey for service providers as well. So those are the data collection methods that we have been using. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking more specifically about what they are. But first, let's look at the poster. So I'm going to turn it over to Sherry.
Hello. You'll notice that the poster you see on there shows a sign, the sign for help, the ASL sign for help. So that sign means help, which was our way of reaching out on the poster in a culturally appropriate way for the deaf community. So asking for their help with this research project, asking them hopefully to be willing to enjoy this in a mutually helpful process. So that's part of what the poster outlined. The wording, you may notice some of the words aren't quote unquote English, they're more an ASL structure. For example, do what? That's one example that we have on the side, and that's more of an ASL structured linguistic phrase. We will provide access, we are indicating on the poster, for anyone who wants to be involved in our research. We will bring interpretation in, we will bring deaf interpreters in, we will bring note takers in, we'll bring whatever accommodation is required by any individual who participates.
All right, thank you, Sherry. So I want to focus now and start looking at some of the specific methods that we used as well. So one of the methods was, again, we did an online survey. But we know that because we're talking about, and our participants are members who are deaf and or hard of hearing, we knew we needed to be accessible and have the survey accessible to them. So in one of our meetings, or in several of our meetings, we talked about how exactly we could do that. And so you'll see a picture here. I have intentionally blocked out his face because the audiovisual film person, I hadn't got his permission yet to show this picture, so I intentionally blocked out his face. I know he will have no difficulty agreeing to us showing it, but because I didn't have his permission, I covered his face. But what we did was, I'm going to turn this over to Jenna Lee to talk a little bit more specifically, but keeping in mind that we spent about 3 or 4 hours at the audiovisual studio at the Bannatyne campus for a very specific reason. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenna Lee.
Hi, everyone. Yes, we did start with the audiovisual process. It was a lot of work. The research questions themselves being in English wasn't necessarily accessible to people, so there was a necessity to translate them into ASL, which is the first language of our community. So we wanted to make sure we provided all the accommodations that any individual might prefer, whether they wanted to read the English or watch the ASL. It was important that we provide all options. So in this process, we did accommodate both. And as a team, we had talked extensively about the research questions, as our priority was, of course, to provide access to the language involved, and so made the necessary changes in order for it to be grammatically accessible. And so we did provide, along with the ASL clips, the English as well. And it was very difficult because there was no voiceover for us to work with, which was a unique thing in this kind of research situation. So as a team, we worked together and we did manage to successfully produce what our goal was.
And so thank you, Jenna Lee. I'm going to talk a little bit and give you a couple of examples of some of those ASL clips and how we matched the clips with American Sign Language and with the English text. But I'm leaving this picture on here for a moment and drawing attention to the facts. So you will notice that Jenna Lee in the center is wearing black. Often, if you will have seen interpreters on TV, for example, whether associated with a newscast or some other event, interpreters are often wearing a dark color. That makes it easier if the person is light-skinned for members of the deaf community who are watching the American Sign Language to see the signing against a darker background. You'll also see that we intentionally, as a team, selected the background that Jenna was standing behind or standing in front of. So the background is a darker, it's a solid gray. We wanted to minimize any distractions as we were filming Jenna creating the ASL clips. So again, thinking very carefully throughout this entire process about how we can make this as accessible as possible for members of the deaf and hard of hearing community, knowing that we also needed to accommodate those who were hearing and for whom English was also their first language. So we really needed to be very conscious across different modes of communication. So mode being spoken English or written English, or sorry, a mode being spoken or written or signed languages, and then across different languages as well being American Sign Language and English. So we really had to consider a number of variables as we were putting together all of these components. So this, hopefully, there we go. Hopefully it will clear up. And so what I want to do is I'm going to click on this so that we have an opportunity to see this actual American Sign Language clip. So again, as I just mentioned, for the online survey that was accessible to the deaf and hard of hearing participants, it was completed in two modes. It was both signed, as you will see Jenna Lee do, and it was also in written English. And the languages were American Sign Language and English. So this is an example of the English text. So I'm sure most of you have participated or completed an online survey. And you will generally see a question with options. You select your options, you click next, and you go to the next question. So that's great. If English is your first language, and if the grammatical structure that you're most familiar with is also English. But American Sign Language has its own grammatical structure. It doesn't necessarily use the same grammatical structure that English does. So consequently, we wanted to be respectful of American Sign Language. When we were creating the questions, as I believe Jenna Lee mentioned, so we came up with an initial list of questions, and then we talked about how we needed to adapt those questions to be more accessible, both, again, to someone who is reading the English version, but also looking at the American Sign Language version. So while we created the survey, and that was one of Karamat's primary responsibilities, was uploading the content into SurveyMonkey. So while we created the English text, we spent, like Jenna Lee has also talked about, we spent about 3 or 4 hours at the audiovisual studio at the Bannatyne campus, videotaping Jenna Lee creating all the ASL clips. Now she did that very much in combination with Sherry. So Jenna Lee would create a clip and Sherry would collaborate, the two of them would collaborate to see if it was the most clear way to say the content. So let's take a look at one of the clips. And our research team want to understand your experiences accessing services in the deaf and hard of hearing community. We're going to collect your information and give it to Manitoba Possible for deaf and hard of hearing services. And we're also going to share the information with other mental health service providers in Manitoba. So while I gave you the oral version of that, for those in the audience who are familiar with American Sign Language, and I believe we have one former sign language interpreter here present, but what we tried to do is when David was the film person, when he created the clips with Jenna Lee, you will notice that she was standing off to the side, and you will see this again in the second clip, but you'll notice that she was standing off to the side, and we added in, oh, hold on, we added in the text. Let's see if I can move this, here we go. So you'll see Jenna is off to the side and we have the English text to the side of her. So again, if someone wants to take the survey and they prefer to read the written English, they can read the written English. If they prefer to watch the American Sign Language version, they can click on the arrow and watch the clip. And then they respond. The answers are provided. So this is an example of one of the questions. The question, of course, in general, how would you rate your overall health? Excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. And so I really want to draw your attention, for those folks not familiar with American Sign Language, watch the facial expression and watch the body language of Jenna Lee. You'll note for those for whom English is a first language, it's a very flat, one-dimensional language. That's not to say that people aren't expressive. We are, as we speak English, for example, but to think about written English, it's a very flat language. But as you'll see with American Sign Language, and you may have noticed as Sherry and Jenna Lee are talking, facial expressions, body language, all of those are valuable, important components of the language itself. So we put this question in here because it really gives a really good sense of what facial expression and the role of facial expression in expressing content. So number one question, in general, how would you rate your overall health? So you can see from that, I'm going to play it again, is you see her facial expression. It's very easy to link which facial expression is matching which word in the written English. And so again, folks didn't necessarily need to read the English to see exactly what Jenna Lee was saying. It was all very clear. And so we knew when we were creating this study that I forget at what point, it was very early on though, that we decided we needed to have an American Sign Language clip of each of the questions. And so that's what we had created. And Jenna Lee also created an American Sign Language version of the introduction to the survey so that folks are deaf and who use American Sign Language as their first language could watch Jenna Lee talk about the survey and where to find the survey to become involved. Because without that, if folks didn't know where to find the survey, we couldn't have participants. So again, the process was very much, has been and continues to be very collaborative. Oh, I'm going to move on. I'm going to turn it over to Sherry.
During our project, a huge impact, of course, was COVID, as you can imagine. And so throughout the research, there were requirements for physical distancing, sanitization, screening, all of those aspects, mask wearing, of course. And so that was all necessary. And you can see in this picture some standard masks that you are familiar with, probably. But for deaf people and through our team research, this kind of mask was going to be a challenge for us because lip reading and other grammar is not accessible with that sort of language. And in deaf culture, expression, facial grammar is very important. It's a huge part of the message. So it was important that we purchase masks that were specialized. In this instance, they're cloth with a window, as you can see in the picture here. And so this is a mask that the woman's demonstrating. And then as restrictions were increased and there was a requirement for medical masks, we went on to get a medical mask through CHA, Canadian Hearing Association.
And so these components very much came into play as we started to focus on the second component of our study, the second method for data collection, which was focus groups. And so now Jenna Lee is going to talk a little bit about the focus groups and how we adapted the focus groups to be more accommodating to folks that are deaf and hard of hearing, and for whom American Sign Language and interpreters are required for the exchange, the careful and clear exchange of communication.
Yeah, our first focus group, we had, of course, be positioned in a circle. That's another aspect of deaf culture. We need to be able to see one another to communicate. Oh, sorry, I'm looking to the wrong poster, I'm being told, or the wrong overhead. Okay, right. Okay, you can see through our list here that we involve deaf and hard of hearing.
Hold on. There we go.
You can see here our focus group criteria for participation in our study was that you had to be deaf or hard of hearing, self-identified. You had to be over the age of 18 or over. And also you had to be able to meet in small groups and share experiences about mental health and be okay with that. So that was the criteria.
Oh, hold on.
So now I'll speak about our first focus group and the setup we had. We are in a circular formation because that's an aspect of deaf culture. That's a requirement in order that we can see each other to communicate. If we were seated in rows like a standard classroom, then people would be unable to fully participate as they wouldn't be able to see each other. And so you can see here the way we've set things up. It was important that people have visual access to the interpreter, whether it be the ASL interpreter or the deaf interpreter, along with the spoken language. We had a fair-sized room and we had no tables, so there were no barriers to communication. It was easy for everyone to see one another. At the end of this, we realized that it wasn't completely successful. There were some challenges as the participants had to crane their necks often to look from one side to the other to access the communication. So that led to missing certain elements of the communication. And you can see where I have the red star. That's indicating that a person doesn't have visual access. They're not able to see everything that's happening, all the communication that's happening.
Maybe Jenna Lee, could you talk about deaf interpreter and the difference between ASL interpreter and deaf interpreter?
Sure, sorry about that. Yes, an ASL interpreter is a certified professional interpreter who is a hearing non-deaf person, whereas a deaf person is a deaf interpreter who will watch the interpretation coming from the ASL interpreter and modify the language to make it completely accessible to a deaf individual depending on their particular needs. And so this gives all our deaf participants the option to either watch the deaf interpreter or the ASL interpreter. And here's another example. And again, the red asterisk identifies where the person had to crane their neck. If they were looking at the ASL person versus the facilitator versus the deaf interpretation. And so because of the setup here and the pace of the information flow, then information could be missed. The second focus group that we had, we were able to position things more effectively. There was a narrower field of view, so it was easier for people to see the interpreter as well as the facilitators without having to move their heads as much. And again, it allowed for them to choose who they wanted to visually access, the DI or the ASL interpreter, along with the facilitator. And in this second focus group, we should have always had one deaf co-facilitator, but in this one instance, we weren't able to have a deaf co-facilitator present because we had a deaf co-facilitator who became ill. And so in this instance, we had two non-deaf facilitators.
So what I just want to do is, so folks can see this, I'm going to go back to the first focus group. And if you can really pay attention to how far across the circle the lines are. So as we think here, the person in the red is the participant. So in order for the participant to look at the American Sign Language interpreter and Jenna Lee as co-facilitator, but if she also needed to look at the deaf interpreter and to look at me as the second co-facilitator, she really, like Jenna Lee said, had to look all the way across the room. And as you can imagine, as he or she is doing that, they're missing out on possible communication. As opposed to when we think about this particular setup, you can see how much more narrow the field was for them, how much shorter the space was for them to look from the interpreter to myself and Jaylene and to the deaf interpreter. It was very, very narrow, as Jenna Lee talked about. So this made it much more accessible to the participants. And it meant that there was a much more reduced chance that information would be lost as the person is moving their head from side to side. Was there anything else with this? I think that was it with that part. Okay. All right, thank you. So those were our components. We had online surveys, we had focus groups. We have done 2 focus groups so far. We've had online surveys completed by participants and service providers, which Karamat will talk about a little bit. But we also have to think about the research process. So we know that as we are conducting research, we are also conducting and processing the data analysis, or conducting the data analysis. When we think about the focus groups, for example, so we did get permission from all participants to videotape the focus groups. Now, why would we do that? It's an unusual request. We don't often videotape our participants, but it was necessary here because American Sign Language is a visual language. And so as we are creating the transcript, you'll see here that the word transcript is intentionally crossed out. And instead, as we think about deaf studies, we use the word translation. A transcript is often a verbatim account of what was said. But how do we do a verbatim account of what was said if what was said is coming through a third person? So instead, what we're doing when we create a transcript is we're creating the translation of what was said. So Karamat and I, we were creating the original transcripts. Now we know their translations. And so Karamat was creating the transcript based on the oral communication from the interpreter. But then when I looked at the transcript that Karamat had originally looked at, I was also able to watch the video itself and look at and add in different components if they seem to be angry. If someone is angry as they're speaking, that may not necessarily be picked up or captured by the interpreter. So I was able to add some of that other dimension to the translation itself. And we know when we think about, because we are going from a shift in language and modality, when we think about creating a final report, a final article, when we think about creating a presentation with our findings, we will be very clear to specify that these are not verbatim quotes taken from participants. They are quotes taken from the translation of their comments. And so we have to be very clear. We have to be very clear that that's what's happening. In my doctoral study, I met with 6 deaf adults. I had an interpreter while I was conducting the study because I had other things to focus on, taking notes, looking at my questions, etc. And what I did was I did a member check with my participants, and I gave them the transcript. I gave the transcript back to them, but I also had an interpreter present as we were sharing the transcript back with each participant. So we met twice. And in the sharing of the transcript, there were a couple of times that participants said to me, I don't know what this word is. I never used this word. I don't know what this means. And so that's a really good example. The transcript wasn't verbatim from the participants, but was the translation from the interpreter of what the participants said. So one word that really stuck out to me was the word pique. The interpreter said, this has piqued my interest. But the deaf person said, I've never used that word. I don't know what the word piqued means. So in reading through the transcript originally and working with the interpreter, we were able to remove that word and change that word for something that the deaf person really had intended when they said their comment. So again, we just have to be clear that this is not a verbatim transcript of the focus groups and what participants said, but it's a translation of, because we are going through a third person, we're going through the interpreter. I'm going to turn this over now to Karamat to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the preliminary findings. We are still recruiting, we're still looking for members, but these are some of the preliminary findings. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Karamat.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Toshi. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so far, the responses from 2 surveys have been encouraging, and for the service provider survey, we have had 21 participants. And for the deaf and hard of hearing survey, we have had 20 participants in the survey. And among these, we have 18 females and we have 2 males who have responded to the survey. Then as it has been said, we have had 2 focus groups interview. So the first focus group consists of 4 participants. And the second one also, we had 4 participants. And in the 2 focus groups, we have 7 females and we have 1 male who have participated. Okay. So here we have an example of the questions that were asked in the online survey for the deaf and hard of hearing. So there is this question that asks if participants know of any mental health or support service for people who are deaf or hard of hearing when they are feeling sad, mad, or wanting to hurt themselves. Okay, like if they are aware of any counselor or group for a deaf or hard of hearing person who is feeling sad or mad or other. But the response revealed that majority don't know of any of this. So majority represented by 75% of the respondents do not know. And we have just 25% of the respondents who know well these services. Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were doing this question too. So we had another question. So question number 16, we're looking at counselor. And if you see that the wording seems, the English wording seems to be a little off, it's only because of the way the question, when I copied the question from SurveyMonkey, but it doesn't actually read this way. So the question reads, if you saw a counselor once but did not go back, why did you not go back? So these are some of the responses. I'm going to switch to this here. You'll see that one person said it was too hard to make an appointment. There was no TTY, which is a device. It's now considered really very old technology. It's a telephone typewriter type of device. CVRS is Canadian Video Relay Service. You'll see one person said it's too hard to make appointments. You'll have 5 people that said it's too expensive. You will have 10 people who said other. Now what I did is, because we don't see the other responses here, is I printed off some of them. One of them was, there's no way to establish a connection. Someone else said, when I went for counseling, I went a few times, but you feel like you're going crazy and you're struggling. I didn't go back. Someone else said the counselor didn't understand who I really was, even after telling them I was hard of hearing. Someone else said the counselor had no knowledge or understanding of deaf culture, so I have to explain. But this person added, I feel tired to teach. Well, it is my problem, not theirs. So the person saying, I don't want to spend all my counseling time explaining what it's like to be a deaf person or American Sign Language or deaf culture. That's not helping them. The participant, the client seeing a counselor, shouldn't have to waste their time explaining about deaf culture. Someone else said, there's no service for deaf or hard of hearing. 2 other responses were there's a lack of understanding of cultural differences or conflicts when you're hearing versus deaf or hard of hearing. And someone else commented and said they reached their maximum number of sessions, but they still weren't happy with the responses. So as we think about, and this is the crux of why we wanted to conduct this study, to look at, are there enough resources? What resources are being provided? How are they being provided? And do folks feel that their needs are being met? So it really was a number of different purposes here. This is one question from the service provider survey. Does your clinic, agency, organization have any service providers who are also deaf sign language users? Of course, the vast majority, 65% or 13 of them said no. I was quite surprised when 6 said yes. And so there are other parts to the question as well. We ask other questions to that. But again, here we look at the fact that there are very few service providers who are able to provide services in American Sign Language, or that deaf folks even are aware of. So I'm going to turn it over to Sherry.
Okay, to date with our research, we've had the focus groups, as we've mentioned, and we are hoping also to further reach out within Manitoba to other communities, other members of the community, and for additional further groups. For example, Winkler, Thompson, other centers such as that. We're hoping to have more folks involved in our research. Once the data has been collected and the analysis is done, we are hoping to develop resources that can help Manitoba Possible to enhance their service provision in terms of mental health and other resources for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So to enhance our service provision.
Mm-hmm. We also talked amongst our team about the fact that, well, Jenna Lee is in the social work program at Booth College, and I'm very excited about that. And while Sherry is the community counselor, we also know that there really are not a lot of deaf professionals. And so the question for all of us, and certainly for me as well, coming from the Faculty of Social Work, is why not? So one of the things I did, we had talked amongst the team, one of the things I had done alongside Jenna Lee, is we went and we talked to students in the grade 11 and 12 class at the Manitoba School for the Deaf to introduce them to the profession of social work. So the intention is perhaps members in, whether it's high school students, maybe they aren't aware of social work, maybe they aren't aware that that might be an option for them, but we really wanted to at least drop the topic on the table to say maybe this is a profession you need to speak about. And we know from our preliminary findings that there simply are not enough deaf or hard of hearing professionals. So we're excited when we finish the study to be able to take our findings and expand that and really have the proof to say, we know that there are more resources that are required, but it's not just having hearing people who know sign language or hearing people who can use American Sign Language interpreters. It's about having members from that community as professionals to provide service. So we're hoping that with this study, we'll be able to find more support for our defense for supporting deaf and hard of hearing folks to become professionals. So on that note, that's our presentation. We want to open it up for questions. So perhaps, well, you have this recording. So I'm going to leave this here just for a very quick moment. And then I will stop sharing and open it up for questions. So I'm not sure, Royce, if you want to facilitate that process. And this was the textbook I was referring to.